The year was 1721, and the rum-soaked taverns of Kingston held more secrets than the Crown's vaults ever would. I was 32 years old that summer, my hands weathered to leather from salt and rope, my eyes permanently squinted from years of reading charts beneath unforgiving Caribbean suns. The Marigold had been our home for 18 months. A brigantine of modest size, but considerable speed, her hull painted black as sin, her sails the color of old bones. We had returned to Kingston after 3 weeks at sea with precious little to show for our troubles. The holds carried gunpowder we'd lifted from a merchant convoy and several barrels of stolen Jamaican sugar, but the crew's spirits sagged lower than our waterline. Captain Edmund Carroll, a Welshman with a scar that twisted the left side of his mouth into a permanent half-smile, had grown increasingly restless. He was a man who trusted celestial navigation and mathematical certainty more than he trusted any living soul. That was why he kept me close. I was his navigator, his chart keeper, his link to the rational world when the sea turned mad. Our crew was the sort every colonial port eventually expelled. There was Rory, an Irishman whose shoulders were as broad as beer barrels and whose temper ignited faster than gunpowder. Mateo, a Portuguese cutthroat with a razor-sharp tongue and hands quicker than thought. Bram, a Dutch Calvinist who whispered prayers each night and desperately tried to hide his faith from the others. Old Finnegan, who'd lost his right leg below the knee to a shark off Barbados and now walked on a peg of polished mahogany, talking more than all the rest of us combined. So, before we continue, please make sure to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. The evening that changed everything began unremarkably. We'd taken over a corner table in the Anchor and Rose, a dockside establishment that smelled of stale beer, vomit, and desperation. The tavern keeper knew us well enough to keep the rum flowing and to look the other way when we conducted our business. We were discussing our next venture, perhaps a raid on the Spanish merchant routes, or possibly a return to the Windward Passage, when a figure stumbled through the door. He was a wreck of a man, completely hairless, not just his head, but his face as well, as though disease or fire had claimed every follicle. His clothes bore the distinctive white stains of long exposure to seawater, mixed with darker patches I preferred not to identify. But it was his hand that captured my attention. 3 fingers on his right hand simply ended at the second knuckle, the stumps healed over with shiny, puckered skin that spoke of old trauma. He dragged himself onto a stool beside our table without invitation. When he saw our coats, our pistols, and the way we positioned ourselves to watch both the door and the windows simultaneously, something sparked in his hollow eyes. "Rum," he croaked to the keeper. Then, leaning closer to us, he said, "There's a place that appears on no chart, you know. No flag claims it. No trade route ventures near it. You cannot see it unless someone points the way." Captain Carroll's head turned, just a fraction. The tavern's cacophony continued around us, but in that moment, our small corner fell absolutely silent. The stranger dipped his ruined finger in spilled rum and traced a shape on the grimy table. A crooked crescent with a hook at one end. His hand trembled as he drew. "Why would we pursue what the traders ignore?" Carroll asked, his Welsh accent thickening slightly, as it always did when he was intensely interested. The man's throat worked, and his eyes, which had seemed dead moments before, suddenly blazed with something. Fear, perhaps, or madness, or both. "Because there's more gold piled on that shore than exists in all the treasuries of the Caribbean combined," he whispered. Chests split open and left to rot under the sun. Cargo from vessels that never reached home. Spanish silver, Portuguese coin, Dutch idols, French jewelry, English cannons, all of it lying where it fell, waiting for someone with the courage to claim it. The men at nearby tables had stopped pretending not to listen. Rory abandoned the sailor he'd been harassing and drifted back toward us. Even Bram, who normally fled any conversation about cursed treasure, leaned forward with uncharacteristic interest. "If such a place existed," Rory growled, his Irish brogue thick with suspicion, "every cutthroat between here and the Guinea coast will be clawing for it." The stranger's eyes went completely flat. They tried. Most never returned. I only survived because I refused to set foot on the sand. Over the next hour, as we kept his cup filled and the coins flowing, the stranger, who gave his name as Jonas, though I suspected it was not the name his mother had given him, told us a tale that should have sent us running. He had sailed with a crew that pursued rumors of Spanish merchants hiding plunder on a secret shore, avoiding the naval patrols that had grown increasingly aggressive after the War of the Spanish Succession. They followed a chain of reports, each one leading further from civilization, until they'd found themselves in waters so remote that my chart showed nothing but blank parchment. We navigated by a line of rocks, Jonas said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They rose from the sea like broken teeth, each one topped with the remains of ships that had come before. The water between them was filled with wrecks, some recent, some ancient, some so old they'd become part of the reef itself. What destroyed them? I asked, my navigator's mind already trying to catalog the hazards. Jonas stared at the table, and for a long moment I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, you won't believe me. I don't care whether you do. I only care that you keep the bottle filled. He described something that moved among the wrecks and along the beach. Something with claws larger than longboats that scraped across wet rock with sounds like boulders grinding together. Something with pale, segmented limbs that emerged from the surf and dragged itself onto the shore with horrifying purpose. He never mentioned a head or eyes, only that wherever this thing went, men vanished. Boats sent to investigate never returned. Waves turned red, then calm again. Old Finnegan scoffed, though his fingers tightened around his cup until his knuckles went white. The man's lost his wits along with his fingers. Some reef tore his crew apart, and his mind gave the reef a shape in his nightmares. Perhaps that was true. Perhaps it should have ended there. But Jonas reached into his salt-stained coat and produced something that stopped all argument. A chain of worked gold, heavy and darkened with age, holding a single oval emerald the size of a robin's egg. The gem caught the weak candlelight of the tavern and seemed to hold it, glowing with an inner fire I'd never seen in any stone before. Taken from the sand, Jonas said. A man threw it to me from a boat that never came back. Captain Carroll took the chain. Its weight pulled his hand downward immediately. I watched his jaw tighten, saw the calculation in his eyes. This single piece was worth more than we'd stolen in the past year combined. Tell me how to reach it, Carroll said. Jonas hesitated. I want passage. Somewhere far from here. The American colonies, perhaps, or back to England. No share of the treasure, just a place on your ship and food until we reach port. You take me, I point the way. After that, you never speak my name. We sailed with him 2 weeks later. The Marigold slipped out of Kingston Harbor on the morning tide, her holds restocked with provisions and fresh water, her crew buzzing with rumors of untouched wealth. On the open ocean, away from the complications of port, the tales spread like fever. They whispered of retiring to English estates, of buying their own fleets, of drowning in rum until their lungs filled. Rory spoke of hiring mercenaries to take entire towns. Matteo fantasized about captaining his own vessel, never sharing spoils again. Bram simply watched the horizon and rubbed the small wooden crucifix he kept hidden beneath his shirt. I kept my eyes on the sky and the compass needle, but curiosity sat heavy in my chest like a lead weight. I'd seen rich prizes before, we all had. None had ever simply been lying on a beach, unguarded and unclaimed. An island full of treasure that no one bothered to protect sounded less like fortune and more like a trap. Yet the chain with the emerald was undeniably real, and it hadn't come from any merchant vessel I could identify. The gold work was strange. Neither Spanish nor Portuguese, neither Dutch nor English. It predated any of those empires, I thought, or came from somewhere they hadn't reached. Jonas gave little away. He remained near the stern most days, back against the rail, eyes fixed not ahead but behind, as though something might be following us. When I approached him for navigational details, he answered with short, precise directions. Turn half a point west at dawn. Hold steady by Polaris when it rises. Avoid that patch of water ahead. It looks harmless, but run shallow beneath, and the rocks will gut your hull. He knew details no drunkard should know. Details no man could know unless he'd sailed these waters many times, or unless he'd been forced to memorize every detail to survive. As we followed his course, the world changed. The trade winds that had pushed us steadily westward began to falter, growing thin and uncertain. Clouds gathered in slow, oppressive layers, gray and featureless, without the violence of storms, but equally without comfort. The sea itself darkened from the brilliant turquoise of the Caribbean to something deeper, almost black in the troughs of waves. The flying fish vanished. No gulls followed our wake, hoping for scraps. The dolphins that usually played in our bow wave were nowhere to be seen. Old Finnegan muttered that the world felt emptied out ahead of us, and I couldn't disagree. One afternoon, whilst taking measurements to fix our position, I noticed something on the main chart. The area we were approaching was almost completely blank, just a faint circle drawn in faded brown ink, so old it had nearly disappeared into the parchment itself. No label, no notes, no warnings. Just that thin ring, as though someone had marked something they didn't want to describe. I pointed it out to Captain Carroll. He looked from his circle to Jonas, who sat alone nearby, and said quietly, he knew it would be there. That's enough for me. On the 10th day, after leaving the familiar shipping lanes, Jonas came to me at dawn as I checked our position by the stars. By sunset, you'll see the teeth, he said. What teeth? I asked. You'll know them when you see them. Once you do, there's no turning back. He'll feel you. I echoed, but Jonas had already walked away. I didn't tell Captain Carroll about that remark. I kept my focus on my instruments, on a mathematics that had always made sense when the world did not. Still, as the sun climbed and the day wore on, I found myself glancing ahead more than down at my tools. The crew grew increasingly subdued as afternoon approached. Even Rory spoke less, though his eyes remained sharp and alert. The air took on a sour scent, like metal left too long in seawater. Late in the afternoon, when the light had turned the peculiar gold gray of approaching evening, old Finnegan's voice rang out from the bow. Rocks ahead. Men rushed forward, boots thudding on damp planks. I followed, shading my eyes against the low sun. A line of stone columns rose from the water ahead, each standing tall and narrow, their tops broken and uneven like shattered teeth. They ran in a crooked curve across our course, stretching from one horizon to the other. Their sides were streaked with pale bands where waves had marked them for years, possibly decades. Between the nearest stones, dark shapes drifted and settled with the swell. At first glance, I mistook them for rocks or coral. Then I saw a mast, its crossbeams snapped and dangling uselessly. A tangle of rotted rigging hung in the water like seaweed. Beyond it lay a hull torn completely open along one side, its ribs exposed to the elements like a gutted fish. Beyond that, another wreck, and another, and another. They crowded the gaps between the stone teeth, dozens of them, half submerged, tilted at impossible angles, some barely visible beneath the surface. A graveyard of ships, each one a testament to failed ambition. Old Finnegan swore under his breath, his face gone pale. Christ preserve us, he whispered. It's a bloody graveyard. Captain Carroll stepped forward, his jaw tight. Helm, bring us downwind of those stones. Reduce sail. I want clear water under us at all times. Aye, Captain, came the response from the wheel. We drifted closer, our canvas trimmed until we barely caught the faint wind. The usual rush of water against our hull faded to almost nothing. The sea here moved in a slow, uncertain way, as though the tides argued with each other about which direction to flow. I watched the waves lap against the wrecks and saw no foam. The surfaces where we'd met water had a dark sheen to them, too dark to be merely rot or algae. Any colors? Rory called out, cupping his hands around his mouth. Any flags we can identify? There used to be, Jonas said quietly beside him. I hadn't heard him approach. There were many. Time, and took them all. Captain Carroll gave him a sharp look. You said you never set foot on shore. I never said I didn't come this close, Jonas replied evenly. The nearest wreck slid alongside as we passed. Its bow was completely gone, leaving splintered beams jutting outward their ends worn smooth by years of washing. A length of chain still clung to the forward section, its links thick with barnacles and growth. But there were no battle scars, no shot holes or burn marks. The vessel looked as though something had simply seized it and broken it apart in one terrible pull. Several of the crew leaned out over our rail, their eyes bright with morbid curiosity. Mateo pointed suddenly. There, on the deck, a figure lay on its back near the shattered mainmast. Only the upper body remained. The spine ended in frayed cloth and yellow bone above where the hips should have been. The skull stared straight upward, jaw hanging open in an eternal scream. Seaweed had wrapped around the ribs and arms, threading through gaps and holding the remains in a grotesque embrace. Crabs scuttled over the bones, their shells dull gray-green. They didn't flee when our shadow passed, merely moved slower, as though they'd been feeding there for so long they no longer feared anything. One of them climbed into the hollow of the skull and settled there, its claws clicking softly. I swallowed against the sudden sourness in my throat. The air here smelled wrong. Beneath the usual salt lay something acrid and sharp, almost metallic, like old blood mixed with rust. It stung the back of my throat and made my eyes water. Seen enough, Captain Carroll said, his voice carefully controlled. Rig a sounding line. I want depth measurements under us every few breaths. We crept along the line of stone teeth, following a narrow channel that Jonas insisted upon. He stood near the bow now, one hand on the rail, eyes fixed on gaps in the rocks that only he seemed able to identify. Old Finnegan cast a lead weight, drew it back dripping, and called out depths. The numbers remained steady, but offered no comfort. We had room beneath our keel, but not enough to feel safe. As we passed another hulk, this one with its stern crushed completely inward, Bram made the sign of the cross on his chest. "This is wrong," he murmured to me, his Dutch accent thick with fear. "Ships don't die in clusters like this without reason." "We know the reason," Rory said, overhearing. "Greed and fools who couldn't navigate properly." But Bram shook his head. "There's more. Something else." I couldn't argue with him. The longer we moved through that maritime graveyard, the more intensely I felt watched. My neck prickled with the sensation of invisible eyes. The crew tried to keep their voices up, maintain their usual bravado, but the talk felt thin and forced. We passed a vessel that had been stripped down to its lowest deck. Only the ribs remained, curving up from the keel like the skeleton of some enormous beast. At each curve, deep marks scored the wood. Parallel grooves ran in pairs, 6 to each side, evenly spaced from one end of the ship to the other with no break in the pattern. Mateo ran his fingers along one of the gouges. His entire hand barely fit into it. "No storm did this," he said quietly. Jonas looked away and said nothing. By the time we cleared the line of stones and wrecks, the sun hung low on the horizon. Ahead, the sea opened for a short distance. Beyond that stretch, a dark smudge sat where sky met water. "There," Jonas said, pointing. "The island. You see it now." He was right. The shape didn't match any landmass I'd ever encountered. It didn't rise into dramatic peaks or cliffs. Instead, it seemed to crouch low and uneven on the horizon, with a rough, irregular edge. No smoke rose from cooking fires, no sign of human habitation. Yet even at that distance, I could make out scattered shapes along its shore. More wrecks, I thought grimly. More graves. Captain Carroll called the men together on the main deck. They gathered in a loose ring, faces drawn and thoughtful. The motion of the ship had changed. The swell felt shorter and jerkier, as though unseen currents pushed from odd angles. "You know why we came?" Carroll said, his Welsh accent strong. "You saw the jewel that paid for this course. You've counted the wrecks we passed. Ships die here, and they don't carry empty holds when they sail. That's the truth of it. We're close now. By tomorrow morning, we can stand on that beach and take what others couldn't. And share their fate," Bram said softly. Carroll ignored him. "We have charts of nothing around us. No Royal Navy patrols cruise here. No Spanish warships will interrupt us. Whatever sits on that shore belongs to us if we have the stomach to claim it. What took the others? Rory asked. For once, his voice lacked its usual aggressive edge. Rocks and bad steering don't car tracks and timber that deep. Jonas spoke before Captain Carroll could formulate an answer. You won't believe it until you see it, he said, his voice hollow. I told you what I could in Kingston. I'll say it again now. Something hunts on this island. It waits in the shallows and shorelands. It can drag men from small boats before they have time to scream. It can crack a hull like you'd crack a walnut. It doesn't tire. It doesn't leave when storms pass. It lives there, and it guards what lies on that beach. Silence settled over the assembled crew. The only sound was the slow slap of water against our hull and the creak of timber adjusting to the swell. Can it be killed? Mateo asked quietly. Jonas hesitated, then admitted, I don't know. I never saw anyone try and survive to tell about it. Captain Carroll stepped into the center of the circle. Every port we've visited since we took the Marigold has held dangers. Soldiers, rival crews, the gallows. We've faced all that for coin that barely kept us afloat and rum-soaked. Now there's a place where wealth sits in heaps, waiting. Something defends it, so be it. If you turn back now, you'll return to the same lean life, the same thin spoils, the same desperate raids for diminishing returns. If you stay the course, you may die. But if you live, you may never need to take another ship again. I'll not force any man. Speak now if you'd have me set a new heading. No one spoke. Men glanced at each other, then at the shadow of the island ahead. Wealth has a pull that fear struggles to match. I'd learned over my years at sea. Even Bram said nothing, though he stared at the deck with his jaw clenched tight. I felt a knot in my stomach that wouldn't loosen. Yet my own hand didn't rise in objection. I thought of the emerald chain Jonas had shown us. I thought of years at sea stretching ahead of me, of growing old on splintered planks, of the quiet, pointless deaths I'd witnessed in nameless harbors and forgotten coves. If something truly hunted on that island, perhaps it could be outwitted. Perhaps we could be the ones to succeed where others had failed. Captain Carroll nodded once. Good. We drop anchor well short of the island tonight and send boats at dawn. No torches on deck. No loud conversation. Whatever lives there shouldn't have long to prepare for us. He strode back to the quarterdeck. Orders rang out in sharp succession. Anchors made ready. Sails came down with practiced efficiency. The Marigold slowed, then drifted, then stopped. The crew moved with unusual care as darkness approached. Voices remained low. Men checked their weapons repeatedly. Pistols, cutlasses, axes, finding comfort in familiar tools, even if those tools might prove useless. As the light faded, the outline of the island grew paradoxically clearer. Short, twisted trees covered much of it, their canopy creating an uneven silhouette. The beach curved inward in a wide bay. Broken masts stood at odd angles along the shore, rooted in the sand where their ships had fallen apart decades, or perhaps centuries ago. I couldn't see the waterline clearly, but my navigator's instincts suggested the depth dropped away quickly near the beach, another hazard for approaching vessels. We dropped anchor when Jonas signaled the appropriate distance. The chain rattled through the hawse, then went taut with a sound like a sigh. The ship steadied. The sea around us lay almost perfectly flat, with only small, irritating ripples disturbing the surface. No wind tugged at our hair or clothes. The air felt thick and muffling, as though we'd sailed into some pocket of the world where normal rules didn't apply. Night fell completely, but the sky above the island remained strangely luminous. Not bright exactly, but not as dark as it should have been given the thick cloud cover. A pale, sickly glow seemed to hang over the place with no obvious source. Not moonlight, not starlight, certainly not any human-made illumination. It made my skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. Men settled where they could, keeping blades close at hand. No songs rose from the deck. No jokes passed between tired sailors. Even Rory sat with his back against the cannon, unusually quiet, his massive hands resting on his knees. Bram murmured over his little crucifix, lips moving in steady rhythm, prayers I couldn't quite hear. I lay on the deck near the rail for a time, staring up at the obscured stars and listening. The usual chorus of insects from a distant shore, the clicks and chirps that typically filled tropical nights, didn't reach us. I heard only the occasional creak of settling timber and the faint tap of loose rope against wood. Then, from somewhere between the island and the line of stone teeth behind us, came a sound I'd never encountered before in all my years at sea. It started low, a dull scraping that seemed to pass through the hull and resonate in my very bones. It rose to a harsh grinding, steady and unhurried, like enormous joints shifting across bare rock. The sound moved with purpose, not random, but deliberate. It stopped, started again, closer. No one spoke. No one moved. The sound passed along some path we couldn't see, circling our position like a predator assessing prey. When it finally faded into the distance, the silence that followed felt heavier and more oppressive than before. I stared into the darkness until my eyes watered and burned. My heart hammered against my ribs like it wanted to escape. I told myself it was only rocks sliding beneath waves, only driftwood scraping against stone. I didn't believe my own rationalizations for even a moment. Sleep, when it finally came in fits and starts, was shallow and broken. I woke repeatedly, absolutely certain that something had bumped our hull, sure that I'd heard something scraping along our keel. Each time, I lay perfectly still and listened until my breathing slowed and exhaustion dragged me back under. At last, pale light touched the eastern horizon. Dawn approached, bringing with it the need to move forward. The crew rose in small groups as light crept across the sky, moving slowly, shoulders stiff from the uncomfortable night. No one mentioned the noise we'd all heard. Men avoided each other's eyes, focusing instead on checking equipment. Belts, pistols, ropes, powder horns. Anything that didn't require acknowledging the dark water around us or what might move through it. I checked the horizon with Captain Carroll's spyglass. The island sat unchanged, still low and uneven, still carrying that faint, unnatural luminescence over its twisted trees. Mist drifted near the sand in thin, restless streamers. Captain Carroll emerged from his cabin, looking as though he hadn't slept at all. His coat hung open, and he carried his spyglass in one hand. He scanned the shoreline for several long minutes before closing the glass with a decisive snap. 2 boats, he announced. 8 men in each. We take weapons, rope, and nothing else. We land near that inward curve where the tide is slowest. Rory crossed his arms across his broad chest. We shouldn't split the crew like this. We need room for whatever we bring back, Carroll replied. And we won't lose men to exhaustion from rowing overloaded boats. Jonas approached, his hairless face somehow even paler in the dawn light. The boats should stay close together. It's safest that way. If they drift apart, he paused, swallowing. It will choose the weaker one first. No one questioned what it meant. The boats were lowered with ropes creaking through pulleys. The hull groaned softly as each boat touched the water, as though the Marigold was reluctant to release us. I took the bow position in the first boat. Captain Carroll sat near the stern. Jonas boarded last, settling beside me with movements that suggested long-healed injuries. The second boat dropped moments later, men climbing down ropes with slow, careful steps. We pushed off. The oars dipped into water that felt oddly dense, almost resistant, yet remained completely calm. The only sound was the soft pull of wood through the sea and our own labored breathing. As we moved away from the Marigold, her dark hull loomed behind us, then gradually drifted into the mist. For a brief moment, I wished Captain Carroll had ordered all of us ashore or none of us. Leaving half the crew behind felt like splitting a body at the spine, leaving both halves vulnerable. Jonas kept his eyes fixed forward. "Follow the deepest blue," he said quietly. I leaned over the gunwale to look and saw what he meant. The water near us shifted from dark green to a narrow band of deeper, almost indigo color that traced an impossible path toward the beach. It curved and bent in ways that defied logic, like a river flowing beneath the sea. "How do you know it's safe?" I asked. "Because it's the only route that ever was," he replied. "Everything else belongs to him." Captain Carroll heard that, but chose not to respond. He watched the island instead, his scarred face expressionless. As we drew closer, details sharpened into disturbing clarity. The beach was broader than I'd initially judged, with patches of smooth sand broken by stretches of jagged volcanic rock. Pieces of wreckage lay everywhere. Planks, broken wheels, sections of railing, coils of rotted rope. Some pieces barely protruded above the sand. Others formed piles high enough to cast shadows in the slanting dawn light. The remains of a longboat sat overturned near the tree-line, its hull cracked but intact enough to recognize the shape. English construction, I thought perhaps 20 years old. There must be a dozen ships' worth of timber here, Mateo whispered from our boat. More, old Finnegan said from the second boat, which followed close in our wake. Some of those pieces are older than any of us. Older than our fathers, likely. The trees behind the shore were short and unnaturally twisted, their trunks growing close together and leaving little open space between them. The branches formed a tangled canopy that blocked most of the brightening sky. I saw no birds, no movement at all except the restless motion of leaves in a breeze I couldn't feel. When we were still perhaps 20 oar strokes from the beach, the water beneath us darkened dramatically. Not like shadow, more like depth suddenly dropping away into an abyss. I leaned over again, gripping the gunwale tightly. Something moved far below, a shifting, slow shape, too large to be any fish I knew, too steady and purposeful to be drifting wood. My stomach clenched into a tight knot. "We shouldn't stop here," I said quietly to Jonas. He nodded once, his jaw tight. "Just reach the sand. Quickly." The boat scraped bottom with a sound that seemed far too loud. Men jumped out, boots splashing, and hauled the vessel onto the beach. The sand felt unnaturally cold beneath my boots, as if it held no warmth despite the rising sun. Captain Carroll stepped forward first, drawing one of his pistols. "Weapons ready," he ordered. "Spread out, but keep each other in sight. We make for the higher ground beyond those trees. Jonas, you guide us." Jonas pointed to our left. "There's a rise that leads to an old clearing. Some of the treasure lies there. Not all of it, but enough to prove the tale's true." Rory lifted his axe and sniffed the air suspiciously. "Smells like rot." "It's not rot," Bram said, his voice strained. "It's something else." He was right. The air held that same metallic edge we'd noticed near the wrecks, but stronger now, almost overwhelming. Like old blood mixed with rust and left to ferment. It stung the inside of my nose and made my eyes water. We moved up the beach in a defensive line, boots sinking into sand that shifted to reveal broken shells and thin splinters of bone. Some clearly belonged to fish. Some very clearly did not. They were too thick, too long, wrong in ways that made my mind refuse to properly categorize them. Near the tree-line, old Finnegan crouched and pointed at tracks with a trembling finger. At first glance, I thought they must belong to some large animal. A bear, perhaps, though bears didn't inhabit Caribbean islands. Then I realized the marks were too precise, too geometric. Each impression had sharp edges, narrow at one end and widening at the other. 8 prints formed a rough, fan shape, pressed deep into the sand with enormous weight. "For the love of God," Bram murmured, making the sign of the cross again. "That's no beast I recognize." Jonas's face had gone absolutely pale, his skin taking on a waxy quality. "This is where it drags itself from the water," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It always comes up this slope, always returns to it." Captain Carroll's jaw tightened, the scar on his face seeming to deepen. "Move." Now, we entered the trees, and the canopy swallowed the light within moments. The air grew absolutely still, heavy with humidity, oppressively damp. My shirt clung to my back with cold sweat. The ground shifted from sand to soil that felt disturbingly soft underfoot, as though it had been turned over and disturbed recently and repeatedly. Fallen branches lay everywhere, but unlike storm damage, these had been snapped cleanly rather than torn raggedly by weather. The breaks were too uniform, too deliberate. Rory nudged one with his boot and frowned deeply. "Something powerful walks through here regularly," he said. "This wasn't done by wind." Jonas stayed near the front of our group, but I noticed he carefully avoided certain patches of earth, stepping around them with practiced precision. When I asked why, he explained tersely, "Roots hide holes. Some go deeper than they look. A man falls in, he doesn't climb back out." I caught glimpses of things that made my mouth go dry. A strip of fabric, once fine linen, now rotted, tangled in a low branch. A rusted pistol half buried in the soil, its wooden grip long since rotted away. A shoe, surprisingly intact, with no foot inside and no sign of what had happened to its wearer. I tried not to dwell on each discovery, but they accumulated like debts I couldn't ignore. The deeper we went, the more signs we found. Some looked recent, fabric still holding color, metal not completely consumed by rust. Some were ancient, items weathered to near nothing by years of tropical rain and heat. Captain Carroll maintained a steady pace despite the evidence of past disasters surrounding us. "We reached the clearing," he said firmly. "We take what we can carry." We returned by exactly the same path. No detours, no exploring, no stupidity. Men nodded, though no one looked particularly convinced the plan would actually hold together once we reached the treasure. As we walked, I felt something shift in the air, not a breeze, not a sound, but something more fundamental. A change in pressure, perhaps, or the quality of silence itself. My ears began to ring faintly, that peculiar sensation you get before thunder strikes nearby. Rory stopped abruptly, holding up one massive hand. "Did you feel that?" he asked, his Irish accent thick. Jonas froze mid-step, his breath catching audibly in his throat. "He knows we're here," he whispered. Captain Carroll raised his pistol, thumb on the hammer. Then we moved faster. The trees thinned ahead, allowing shafts of sickly light to filter through the canopy. We approached cautiously, trying to keep our boots silent on the soft ground, though I suspected stealth was a luxury we'd already lost. The clearing opened before us like a wound in the forest. At first glance, it appeared to be merely a shallow bowl of dirt and stones, perhaps 30 yards across. Then my eyes adjusted to the light and the scale, and I understood what we were seeing. Chests lay scattered across the clearing, dozens of them. Some stood open, their lids thrown back. Some remained locked, their iron bands still intact. Some had been smashed apart, their contents spilled. Coins covered the ground in dull heaps. Spanish pieces of 8, Portuguese cruzados, Dutch guilders, English sovereigns, all mixed together and half buried in the soil. Silver cups lay, tipped over, their surfaces tarnished black. Gold plate glinted from beneath layers of accumulated dirt. In the far corner, a long row of cannons lay half buried, their barrels eaten away by decades of rust, but still recognizable as valuable bronze guns. Several men gasped audibly. Matteo dropped to his knees at once, his hands trembling as he scooped up a handful of coins. They cascaded through his fingers like water, clinking softly. "By all the saints," he whispered reverently. "It's real. It's all real." Rory laughed, a low, almost disbelieving sound. "We're bloody rich. We're actually rich." Captain Carroll allowed them one brief moment to absorb what they were seeing, but his voice cut through their wonder like a blade. "Gather quickly. No shouting, no wandering off. Take only what you can carry comfortably. We may need to run." I moved to a half-open chest and pushed the lid fully aside. Inside, packed tightly together like firewood, I found bars of silver. Each one bore the stamp of the Spanish mint in Potosi. Their weight pulled at my arms as I lifted one experimentally. It felt solid, real, impossible to dismiss as fantasy. Then the ground trembled. It was subtle at first, just a faint vibration that moved through the soil and into my boots. Not fast, not violent, but steady and deliberate. The approach of something massive, something that didn't need to hurry because nothing could escape it anyway. The vibration came from below and beyond, somewhere in the direction of the beach we'd left behind. Jonas spun toward the trees, his hairless face contorted with terror. "He's coming." The tremor grew stronger, more pronounced. A deep scraping sound echoed faintly through the forest. That same sound we'd heard during the night, but louder now, More immediate, unmistakably closer. Captain Carroll raised his pistol toward the tree line. "Drop what you're carrying. Form up defensive positions. No one runs until I give the order." My breath tightened painfully in my chest. I desperately wanted to believe we could stand our ground, that our weapons and our numbers would matter, but something in that approaching vibration, in its steadiness, its absolute certainty, left no room for confidence. The soil shifted again. Closer, much closer. Then the trees at the edge of the clearing began to move. Not sway in wind, move. Their trunks bent in slow, forced arcs, pushed aside by something large enough to part them without effort, without hesitation. Jonas's whisper was barely audible. Too late. Branches snapped in steady, rhythmic intervals as the shape pushed through the undergrowth toward us. I stepped backward until my shoulders touched the edge of an overturned chest, my heart hammering so hard I thought my ribs might crack. The men beside me raised their weapons, but I could see their hands shaking. Even Rory, who'd never feared any opponent in a fair fight, tightened his grip on his axe until his knuckles went bone white. The clearing grew deathly quiet except for the sound of trees being methodically forced apart. The steady rhythm somehow made it worse. Whatever moved toward us wasn't rushing, wasn't hesitating, wasn't uncertain. It advanced with calm, absolute certainty, as though it had done this countless times before and expected no resistance that would ultimately matter. The first part of it broke through the tree line, and my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. A pale limb extended forward into the clearing, not like an arm or a leg as I understood them, but something alien and wrong. It was jointed in 3 segments, each one thicker than a grown man's torso. The surface appeared hard and dull, like old bone or weathered shell, covered with cracks and marks that suggested enormous age, but no weakness whatsoever. The end terminated in a broad, curved claw that dug into the soil with such weight I could feel the impact through the ground beneath my feet. Another limb followed, then a third, then a fourth, each positioned with deliberate, intelligent placement. Men gasped and staggered backward. Bram clutched his crucifix to his chest with both hands. Mateo covered his mouth as though to hold back vomit or screams. The body behind the limbs emerged next, and the true scale became horrifyingly apparent. It was enormous, far larger than any creature I'd ever encountered or even imagined. A thick, dome-like shell covered its entire upper body. The shell was deeply uneven, covered with ridges and raised patterns that caught the dim forest light in muted, shifting patches. Several long spines protruded from its back, each one as thick as a ship's mast and longer than I was tall. The legs lifted and settled with slow, controlled precision, carrying the creature farther into the clearing until half its bulk had emerged from the forest. Each footfall shook loose soil from the heaps of treasure. The worst part came when it stopped advancing and simply waited. It lifted its front half slightly, raising the forward edge of the shell. Beneath it, where a head should have been, hung a mass of articulated mouth parts, each segment moving with small, careful motions as though tasting the air, analyzing us, deciding. The grinding noise we'd heard the previous night returned, emanating from this movement with a low, bone-vibrating rhythm that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly in my skull. "It guards the island," Jonas said, his voice cracking. "It comes to anything that makes noise or disturbs the ground, anything that threatens what it protects." Captain Carroll aimed his pistol at the creature with hands that, for the first time since I'd known him, trembled slightly. "Hold steady," he ordered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "If it charges, fire at the joints first. Aim for the limbs." Rory stepped forward half a pace, raising his axe. "We stand together," he muttered, as much to convince himself as to inspire the others. "We've faced worse odds." I wanted desperately to believe him. My legs felt unsteady, weak, but I forced my stance wider and held my pistol up with both hands to keep it from shaking visibly. The creature paused, its limbs settling deeper into the soil. Every joint remained tensed, coiled, ready. Then it moved one deliberate step toward us. The ground shook hard enough that several men lost their balance entirely. Bram fell to one knee with a cry. Mateo grabbed his arm and hauled him upright. The creature moved again, slow, heavy, measured, inevitable. "Fire!" Captain Carroll shouted. The crack of multiple pistols split the air. Smoke burst from barrels in gray clouds. I watched the lead ball strike the creature's front limb and simply bounce off, flattening against the hard surface and dropping to the dirt with soft, almost gentle clatters. A few struck the shell directly and achieved even less, leaving not even scratches on that ancient carapace. The creature showed absolutely no reaction. It didn't flinch. It didn't pause. It simply continued its advance as though we'd done nothing more threatening than throw pebbles. Rory roared, a sound of pure frustration and terror combined, and rushed forward, swinging his axe with all his considerable strength. The blade struck one of the forward limbs with a sound like striking stone. The axe rebounded so violently it nearly flew from Rory's hands. Captain Carroll grabbed his shoulder. "Hold," he snapped. We fall back toward the trees. Organized retreat, not a rout. Jonas shook his head frantically, his entire body trembling. Not the trees. The roots there are too loose, the ground too unstable. If a man falls, he doesn't get back up again. I've seen it happen. The creature stepped closer still, now less than 20 feet away. Its mouth parts twitched and shifted. A long, thin appendage extended from somewhere beneath the shell, sweeping across the soil like a blind man's cane. When it touched a broken piece of timber from one of the treasure chests, the wood cracked instantly with a sound like a pistol shot. "Move toward the left path," Jonas said urgently, pointing with a shaking hand. "There's firmer ground that way. Higher ground. It's our only chance." Captain Carroll hesitated for only a heartbeat. "Go. Move now." We backed away slowly at first, weapons still raised uselessly, trying desperately not to trip on the scattered treasure. Coins slid treacherously under our boots. A chest lid fell inward with a dull thud. The sound echoed across the clearing like a bell. The creature's limbs tightened, joints flexing. It moved faster, much faster. "Run!" Captain Carroll shouted, abandoning all pretense of organized retreat. We turned and sprinted. The soil shifted and buckled under each panicked step. Branches whipped at our arms and faces as we plunged into the narrow path Jonas had indicated. Behind us, the creature crashed into the clearing properly, smashing through treasure chests like they were made of paper. Wood splintered. Metal rang against stone. Someone screamed, a high, terrified sound that cut off abruptly. The trees closed around us, but the noise behind us only grew louder. The scraping of enormous limbs against earth. The thud of its massive body forcing between trunks. That steady, terrible grinding sound. Mateo stumbled over a root. I grabbed his arm without slowing, hauling him forward with strength I didn't know I possessed. Bram clung to the back of Rory's coat to stay upright, being half dragged, half running. Jonas pushed ahead with frantic energy, carving a path between roots and low branches with the desperate precision of someone who knew exactly what pursued us. The ground trembled continuously now. Dust and debris fell from leaves overhead. I risked a glance backward and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was forcing itself between the trees, bending trunks outward with casual, terrifying strength. Its limbs reached through the gaps, each one moving independently, searching. Bark cracked and splintered under its weight. As I watched, one of those pale limbs hooked around a trunk as thick as my torso and simply tore it from the ground in a single, smooth pull. The tree's roots ripped free of the soil with a sound like tearing cloth, magnified 1,000-fold. We cannot possibly outrun this. Bram gasped between ragged breaths. It's too fast, too strong. Jonas looked back over his shoulder, his hairless face streaming with sweat. It doesn't chase deep into the island. It prefers open spaces near the water. We just need to reach the inner ridge. There it will stop. How far? Captain Carroll demanded, his usual composure completely shattered. Close, Jonas said. Very close now. We pushed harder, muscles screaming in protest. Branches whipped our faces hard enough to draw blood. Roots seemed to deliberately drag at our feet. The path narrowed twice, forcing us to shift sideways, precious seconds lost. The creature continued smashing through the forest behind us, but its speed did begin to slow. Its enormous limbs couldn't maneuver as easily in the increasingly tight spaces between the ancient trees. Rory turned while still running and hurled a heavy piece of driftwood at one of the pursuing limbs. It bounced off harmlessly. The creature barely paused. We reached the rise Jonas had mentioned. The ground angled sharply upward, the soil visibly firmer here, embedded with rocks. We scrambled up desperately, grabbing at stones and low roots, pulling ourselves higher. The creature reached the base of the incline moments later. Its front limbs struck the slope, claws digging in. Its shell scraped against tree trunks with a sound that set my teeth on edge. It tried to climb, pulling its massive bulk upward. "Keep moving," Captain Carroll shouted hoarsely. "Don't stop until you reach the top." I climbed until my lungs burned, until my hands bled from gripping sharp rocks, until my legs trembled so violently I could barely control them. Mateo's boots slipped once, threatening to send him tumbling back down, but I hauled him forward by his collar with desperate strength. Bram's breathing came in short, panic bursts. Old Finnegan somehow kept pace despite his wooden leg, gripping stones with practiced, hard-won balance. When we finally reached the flat ground at the summit, we turned as one to look back. The creature was still at the base of the incline, still trying to climb. It pulled itself higher inch by agonizing inch, its limbs sinking deep into the slope. Splinters of rock flew as its claws dug in with enormous force. Jonas raised one trembling hand, pointing. "This is where it stops. It has never crossed this point. The ground is wrong for its weight, too loose, too steep." At first, I thought he was simply lying out of desperate hope, trying to convince himself as much as us. But as we watched, breathing hard, the creature strained upward, and its weight caused the soil beneath it to break and shift. Its limbs slipped, then slipped again. It couldn't gain proper purchase. The creature released a sound. That low, grinding noise, but deeper now, vibrating through the entire ridge with a quality that felt almost like rage or frustration. Then, slowly and deliberately, it released its grip on the rocks. It backed down the incline with the same controlled precision it had shown throughout, its legs moving in careful, measured steps. When it reached the flat ground below, it stood absolutely still for what felt like an eternity. Then it turned, not in retreat, but with the patient deliberation of something that knew we couldn't leave the island the way we'd arrived. It moved back toward the beach at that same unhurried pace, returning to its territory, returning to wait. When the sound of its movement finally faded into the distance, the ridge felt absolutely silent. Men collapsed onto the stone around me, gasping for breath with sounds almost like sobbing. Mateo sat with his head lowered between his knees, hands trembling uncontrollably. Bram knelt with both palms pressed flat to the ground, whispering broken prayers in Dutch. Rory lay on his back, his massive chest rising and falling in deep, labored heaves. Old Finnegan wiped sweat from his weathered brow with a hand that shook like a leaf in wind. Captain Carroll walked to the edge of the ridge, staring down the slope we'd just climbed. "We're trapped here," he said quietly, his Welsh accent thick. "The boats, the ship, it will wait for us there. It knows we have to come back eventually." Jonas met his gaze and nodded slowly. That was always the risk, always the price of coming here. But there's a way off this ridge. There's higher ground beyond the center of the island. From there, we may find another path down to the water, but only if we move before nightfall. Only if we don't stop moving. Captain Carroll turned toward the rest of us, his scarred face gray with exhaustion, but still determined. "You heard him. We stay alive by moving forward. We rest for 5 minutes, not a second longer. Then we march." I stood slowly, painfully, wiping dirt and blood from my palms. My legs ached abominably, but I forced myself upright. I looked once more toward the path behind us, at the bent and broken trees that marked the creature's trail like a scar carved into the forest itself. Its patience frightened me far more than its strength. It hadn't raged or roared. It had simply pursued us with calm certainty, knowing that time and the island's geography were on its side. We began walking again within minutes, as promised. This time, no one spoke at all for the better part of an hour. Only the sound of our footsteps broke the oppressive silence. The ridge ahead rose into deeper, older forest. The air grew noticeably cooler. The ground became firmer underfoot, less disturbed, but the island still felt intensely aware of us. Everything about this place seemed to be watching, listening, waiting that we moved deeper along the ridge, maintaining a tight formation so no one could slip away between the stones and vanish. The trees here grew farther apart than near the beach, though still dense enough to block most direct sunlight. Thick, gnarled roots crawled across the ground in serpentine patterns. Some sections of soil looked disturbingly fresh, turned over as though something heavy had passed through recently, days or weeks earlier, perhaps, rather than years. Every so often, someone's boot would strike something buried, a plank, a rusted piece of metal, fragments of things that didn't belong in a forest. This entire island felt like a graveyard that had swallowed entire ships whole and allowed their remains to rot quietly beneath the surface, slowly being digested by the earth. Mateo wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "How did anyone ever escape this place?" he asked Jonas, his Portuguese accent making the question sound almost plaintive. Jonas didn't stop walking, didn't turn around. Some reached the ridge, like us. Some made it to the far cliffs. Not many, perhaps 1 in 10. The ones who survived longest stayed together. They kept their minds steady, didn't panic, didn't scatter. Rory grunted, his Irish pride reasserting itself. "Our minds are perfectly steady." Jonas didn't answer, but I saw his shoulders tense. We passed what had clearly once been a campsite not far ahead. A half-buried fire ring constructed from deliberately placed stones. A patch of permanently scorched earth. The rusted remains of a cooking pot lying on its side. A broken cutlass hilt protruding from the soil like a gravestone, its blade long since rotted away or carried off. Someone had tried to survive here, to wait for rescue, or build something to escape with. Someone had failed. Old Finnegan paused and tapped the fire ring with his wooden peg, making a hollow sound. These stones were positioned by hand, he observed. 2 men, maybe 3, working together. Bram crouched and brushed accumulated dirt away from the stones carefully. "Look at the moss growing on them," he said quietly. "They've been here decades at least, perhaps longer." Captain Carroll gestured impatiently for us to continue. "We don't linger over old bones. We need to put distance between ourselves and that creature's hunting range." Jonas pointed ahead through the trees. "The ridge widens there. After that section, the land dips down before rising again. That second rise leads toward the middle of the island, the highest point. If we reach it before dusk falls completely, we'll have a clear view of the far side. The cliffs. What's on the other side of those cliffs?" I asked, my navigator's mind already trying to calculate distances and possibilities. Jonas hesitated before answering. "Sharp cliffs. Very steep. The sea breaks against them with considerable force. But there may be a way down if the tide is low enough. If we can reach the water on that side, we can fashion something, a raft, perhaps, and let the current carry us away from this cursed place." "Maybe," Mateo muttered under his breath, his skepticism clear. Jonas ignored the comment and kept moving with steady determination. The ridge began to slope gently downward, forcing us to slow our pace to avoid slipping on loose stones. At one point, Bram lost his footing entirely, arms windmilling. Rory's massive hand shot out and grabbed his arm, holding him upright with casual strength. "Watch your bloody step," Rory said, not unkindly. "Thank you," Bram whispered, his face pale. We reached flatter ground after several careful minutes. The forest here felt distinctly different from what we'd traversed before. The trees grew noticeably taller, spaced wider apart, with straighter, thicker trunks. The scent in the air shifted as well, less metallic, more genuinely earthy and organic. It wasn't exactly comforting, but it felt marginally less hostile than the beach or that terrible clearing. The quiet, however, grew even more oppressive and unnatural. "Not a bird," old Finnegan murmured, his eyes scanning the canopy nervously. "Not a single insect. Nothing at all. Nothing living wants to be heard here," Jonas said flatly. "Sound draws attention. Attention brings him." We continued forward until we reached an open stretch of land broken by massive boulders, some standing as tall as the Marigold's main deck. Their surfaces had been worn almost completely smooth, as if water had once flowed around them for centuries, though we were now well above sea level. One particularly large boulder had a sizable cavity at its base, like a shallow cave. Rory pointed his axe at it suspiciously. "Something live in that." "No," Jonas said with certainty. "He doesn't climb this far inland. Doesn't need to." Matteo echoed, shaking his head. "We keep giving it the characteristics of a man, as though that makes it less terrifying. It's a creature, a beast, nothing more." Jonas didn't correct him, but his expression suggested he disagreed fundamentally with that assessment. Captain Carroll climbed onto one of the smaller rocks to gain elevation, scanning ahead for the safest route forward. The ground should begin rising again soon. Not far from here, according to our guide. I followed him up to get a better vantage point. From the higher position, I could see faint markings in the soil ahead, deep grooves running across the ground, parallel to each other. At first glance, I mistook them for marks left by dragged timbers. Then I noticed the spacing, too wide, too perfectly straight, with no wood anywhere near them. Jonas stepped up beside me, following my gaze. "Those are old tracks," he said quietly, "from long ago, when he used to venture further inland. Perhaps he wandered more widely then, before he settled into his current territory. Now he stays much closer to the water, guards the beach and the shallows." "That doesn't comfort me in the slightest," I admitted. "It shouldn't," Jonas answered. "It just means we're temporarily outside his preferred hunting ground. Temporarily." We descended from the rock and pushed forward again. The land did indeed begin to slope upward, as Jonas had promised. The air thinned very slightly with elevation. My shoulders relaxed marginally, though I remained intensely alert. Then a distant thud echoed through the forest somewhere behind us. We stopped instantly, frozen in place. Another thud followed, slow, evenly spaced, deliberate. The sound reverberated through the trees with a quality that made my chest vibrate. Rory tightened his grip on his axe until the wooden handle creaked. "It's on the move again." Jonas nodded grimly, moving back toward the beach, checking the clearing, making sure we fled. "It will wait there now. Wait for us to attempt returning the way we came." Matteo swallowed audibly. "Wait for what exactly?" "For us to have no other choice," Jonas said. "For desperation to drive us back to the boats. It's patient, far more patient than any human." A chill crawled up my spine like cold fingers. The idea of returning to that shore, of trying to reach our boats with that thing waiting, felt utterly impossible. Yet the thought that the creature expected exactly that it was counting on our predictability, made the island feel even more like an elaborate trap, with walls we couldn't see but couldn't escape. Captain Carroll motioned us forward urgently. "We keep moving. Standing still means death, one way or another." We resumed climbing. The incline steepened noticeably. Roots formed natural steps here and there, which we used gratefully. Bram slipped twice, each time catching himself before falling. Old Finnegan struggled visibly with his wooden leg, but refused all offers of assistance with stubborn pride. Rory pushed ahead almost eagerly, as though preferring physical exertion to the constant psychological dread that hung over us. My legs burned with effort. Sweat dripped steadily down my back despite the cooler air at this elevation. But then the trees began to thin ahead, and genuine bright light spilled between their branches. Not the sickly, filtered glow we'd experienced so far, but actual sunlight. "We're near the summit," I said, trying to keep the relief from making me sound too hopeful. Jonas nodded, breathing hard. we'll be able to see the other side of the island. The cliffs. Our way off this cursed rock. We pushed up the last steep stretch until the ridge finally opened into a broad, relatively flat rise. A gust of wind hit us immediately, cold, sharp, beautifully clean. It was the first true breeze we'd felt since making landfall at dawn, and we let it wash over us with profound gratitude, grateful for anything that smelled like fresh, untainted air rather than blood and rust. We walked carefully to the edge of the rise and looked down at the far side of the island spread below us. Cliffs stretched along the coastline in dramatic, jagged lines, sheer drops of volcanic rock descending perhaps 200 feet to the churning sea below. Waves crashed against the base with tremendous force, sending white spray upward in sheets. Several dark sea caves opened at the base of the cliffs, their mouths gaping like wounds. Scattered wreckage lay caught in the rocks. Broken masts, torn canvas, pieces of hull that had been wedged into crevices and become permanent fixtures over time. Mateo pointed toward a narrow, precarious path winding down the cliffside. "There," he said. "We can climb down that way." Bram studied the path and shook his head doubtfully. "It doesn't look stable at all. Look at all those cracks in the rock." "We'll test it as we go," Captain Carroll said firmly. "If it holds our weight, we descend. Once we reach the beach at the bottom, we can circle around the island's perimeter. The creature patrols the main bay where we landed, not these remote cliffs. If we can find materials, driftwood, rope, anything, we can construct a crude raft and push off. Let the current do the work." Jonas breathed out slowly, his expression showing the first hint of hope I'd seen since Kingston. "This is our best chance. Perhaps our only chance." But the island, it seemed, didn't intend to let us feel hopeful for long. A faint vibration reached us from the direction we'd come. Not strong, not fast, but unmistakably steady and purposeful. The same rhythm we'd learned to dread. Jonas's face went absolutely pale, all color draining away. "He's returned to the ridge. He's searching." Captain Carroll drew his pistol in one smooth motion, though we all knew how useless it had proven. "We move immediately. No delays, no rest. Every second counts now." We formed a careful line and approached the narrow cliff path. The wind pushed against us aggressively, tugging at our clothes, making balance difficult. Small pebbles and stones rolled off the edge and disappeared, falling for long seconds before we heard the faint splash far below. Rory tested the first step cautiously. The stone held. He tested the next, distributing his considerable weight carefully. It also held, though it shifted slightly under his boot. "Slow and careful," Captain Carroll ordered. "One person at a time. Stay as close to the wall as possible." Rory started downward, moving with surprising delicacy for such a large man. Mateo followed a few feet behind, then Bram, his face rigid with barely controlled fear. Jonas stepped after them, his movements practiced but tense. Old Finnegan waited his turn, gripping the rock face with both hands, his wooden leg held carefully. I waited behind him, my heart hammering. Captain Carroll took the rear position, as any good captain should. Halfway down the cliff face, the path shifted ominously under Rory's boots. He froze instantly, spreading his weight. Loose stones tumbled from beneath him, bouncing and clattering down the cliff before disappearing into the surf below. The entire line went absolutely motionless. "Don't move," Jonas whispered upward with desperate intensity. "Not 1 inch, not one muscle." We stayed frozen like statues until the rocks finished falling and the path settled. My legs began to cramp from holding position, but I didn't dare shift my weight. The vibration from above approached again. Faint still, but unmistakable. That grinding, scraping sound we come to know so intimately. Jonas looked up at me and Captain Carroll, his eyes wide with fear. "We must go faster. If he reaches the ridge summit, he may find another way down. He knows this island better than we ever could." Captain Carroll nodded sharply. "Move carefully, but move quickly. No freezing again unless someone's about to fall." We descended faster, throwing caution partially to the wind out of sheer necessity. My hands grew increasingly sore from gripping rough stone. My boots slid twice on loose gravel, and each time my heart leapt into my throat before I managed to steady myself. Jonas guided Bram around a particularly narrow bend. Matteo kicked aside loose rocks as carefully as time allowed. Rory grunted with exertion at each step, but never stopped moving. We reached a wider ledge, perhaps halfway down the cliff. Just enough space for all of us to stand without touching the precipitous edge. Old Finnegan immediately collapsed onto one knee, breathing in ragged gasps. "I'm too old for this madness," he wheezed. "None of us are the right age for any of this," Matteo said, attempting humor and failing completely. Captain Carroll raised one hand for silence. "Rest for exactly 1 minute, not a second longer. Catch your breath." We stood in tense silence, listening. The distant vibration hadn't reached the rise yet, but it was definitely closer than before, growing closer with each passing moment. After what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, Captain Carroll motioned for us to continue. That was when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A faint trail of moisture on the stone wall beside us. Not water, but something thicker, more viscous. It formed a deliberate trail that descended past our ledge and vanished onto the lower path below. Jonas followed my gaze, and his entire face tightened with recognition and renewed fear. "That isn't water," he said quietly. Before I could ask what it was, he knelt and touched the trail with 2 fingers. When he held them up, a thin, clear substance stretched between his fingertips like spider silk, but stronger, more deliberately produced. "Webbing," Jonas said, his voice flat and dead. He wiped the strand from his fingers with visible disgust. The substance clung stubbornly before finally snapping. Even once broken, it left a faint stickiness on his skin that he couldn't seem to completely remove. Rory frowned deeply. "What in God's name does that mean?" Jonas remained crouched, staring at the residue on the stone wall. "He comes down here. Not often. He prefers to stay near the main beach. But sometimes when something reaches these cliffs, he drags himself along this wall to investigate. The webbing is from him, from something he produces or uses." Bram's whisper was barely audible. "Then we aren't safe anywhere on this island." "No," Jonas agreed simply. "We aren't. We never were." Captain Carroll looked at the lower path stretching below us. "We're too far down to turn back now, even if we wanted to. We continue. Keep your eyes open for more of that webbing. Don't touch it if you can possibly avoid it." The wind cut through our position again, noticeably colder now, carrying the salt spray from the waves crashing below. I didn't question Jonas further. His silence communicated everything we needed to know about the danger. We moved onward and downward. Rory descended first again, his boots scraping on stone, every movement now cautious and hyper-alert. Matteo followed closely, leaning hard into the wall to maintain balance. Bram muttered continuous prayers between labored breaths, his Dutch words blending with the sound of wind and waves. Old Finnegan gripped each handhold and foothold with his good foot and his peg leg, his years of experience with the prosthetic serving him well despite the treacherous conditions. Jonas continued guiding us with short, terse gestures, warning whenever the stone darkened suspiciously or felt unstable under tentative pressure. As we descended, the webbing grew more frequent and more obvious. We saw thin strands stretched across rocks, spanning small gaps, sometimes wrapped around broken branches that had been wedged into crevices in the cliffside. None were thick enough to physically hinder our progress, but they marked a path the creature had traveled, possibly recently. "Keep your hands where you can see them clearly," Jonas instructed quietly. "Some strands are very old, dried and harmless. Some are fresh. You don't want to discover the difference by accident." I nodded, making absolutely certain to keep my fingers on bare stone only, avoiding anything that looked remotely suspicious. The path ahead narrowed again dramatically, forcing us back into single file. The waves below crashed louder than before, much closer now. Cold spray reached our faces in intermittent bursts, mixing with sweat and making visibility difficult. Ahead, the cliff curved sharply inward, forming a deep pocket of shadow that the afternoon sun couldn't penetrate. Rory stepped into the shadowed area first. He froze completely, his entire body going rigid. "What is it?" Mateo whispered urgently from behind him. Rory didn't answer immediately. He simply lifted his axe very slowly, shifting his stance into something braced and intensely defensive. Mateo edged up beside him carefully and sucked in a sharp breath. Then I saw what had stopped them both. A man's body lay wedged between two jagged stones in the shadowed recess, positioned head down with legs twisted at angles that made my stomach turn. The corpse had dried completely long ago, the skin pulled tight around bones, leathery and preserved by salt air. His clothes were little more than rotted tatters clinging to the skeletal frame. A length of rope still hung from his waist, trailing off the edge of the cliff path and disappearing into empty air. His right arm stretched upward toward the wall above him, hand frozen mid-reach in a desperate final gesture. A long, thin strand of that clear webbing connected his fingers directly to the stone, as though he'd grabbed it trying to pull himself up. "He tried to climb back up," Jonas said quietly, his voice empty of emotion. "He didn't get far at all." Bram stepped backward instinctively. "We shouldn't be here. This entire place feels fundamentally wrong." Captain Carroll kept his voice steady through visible effort. "Keep moving. Don't touch anything. Don't look at him. Just move." We edged around the corpse, staying as far from it as the narrow path allowed. I passed close enough to smell the dried salt in the curled fabric, close enough to see how his fingers had worn through to bone from clawing at the rock. My throat tightened painfully. I tried desperately not to imagine the man's final moments, stranded on this cliff path, exhausted and injured, reaching upward with failing strength while something massive dragged itself down the cliff face toward him, inevitable and unstoppable. Once we'd passed the body, the path widened again slightly, offering marginal relief. The sea crashed much harder now, the sound amplified by the angle of the cliff face. The tide was noticeably higher than when we'd first looked down from above. We needed to reach the bottom quickly, before the water rose further and cut off access to the beach entirely. Jonas signaled urgently for increased speed. "We're close now. The last section is very steep, but it will get us down to the rocks. Once we're at sea level, we can move. Assuming that thing doesn't find us first," Mateo muttered. "Move faster and it won't matter," Captain Carroll snapped. The final descent began immediately. The path transformed into something more like a half staircase of jagged, uneven stone. The handholds were narrow, but steady enough if you tested them first. Rory went down first again and reached the bottom without significant issue, landing on solid rock with visible relief. Mateo followed carefully, then Bram. Old Finnegan hesitated at the final drop. It was nearly 6 feet, but Jonas steadied him and helped lower him down. I climbed down after them, testing each foothold with paranoid care. Captain Carroll came last, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd spent his entire adult life on ships and ropes. When my boots finally hit the rocks at the base of the cliff, I breathed out in profound relief, my legs trembling with exhaustion and accumulated fear. The sand lay close, perhaps 50 paces away across tumbled boulders. The tide washed through gaps in the rocks, surging forward and retreating with rhythmic persistence. "We made it," Mateo said, and for the first time in hours, he almost smiled. "Not yet," Jonas replied immediately, scanning the cliffs above us with obvious paranoia. "We need to cross these rocks before the tide rises further. The beach will take us around the island's perimeter, but only if the water stays low enough to allow passage." We started forward immediately, not wanting to waste whatever time we had. The rocks were treacherously uneven, slick in places with seaweed and spray, sharp in others with volcanic edges that could easily slice through boot leather. Bram nearly slipped twice before Rory caught his arm with reflexes honed by years of fighting. Old Finnegan took excruciatingly careful steps, testing each stone with his wooden leg before committing his weight. Jonas avoided certain cracks between boulders with obvious purpose, warning us each time. "Don't step there. The gap goes deeper than it looks. A man's leg could go through. Trap him." As we picked our way across, that metallic scent from the beach intensified dramatically, mixing with the salt spray. Waves crashed harder behind us, each one reaching slightly farther up the rocks. The tide was definitely rising. We were running out of time. Then a sound rose above the constant roar of water, a slow, deliberate scraping coming from our left. Jonas froze mid-step. He's near, very near. Captain Carroll drew his pistol, though his hand shook slightly. Where exactly? Jonas pointed with a trembling finger toward a break in the rocks where a shallow cave opened its dark mouth to the sea. The entrance was low and wide, shadowed even in the afternoon light. Thin strands of clear webbing hung from its edges like decorative curtains. He uses the caves when the tide is high, Jonas explained, his voice barely audible over the waves. He waits there, listens for anything that moves on the rocks. The scraping sound grew distinctly louder, more immediate. Something was shifting inside that cave, something massive. We dropped instinctively into a crouch behind a cluster of larger boulders, making ourselves as small and invisible as possible. My heart hammered so violently, I thought it might be audible over the ocean. The cave mouth darkened further as something enormous shifted within, blocking what little light penetrated the entrance. "We can't fight that thing," Rory whispered, his earlier bravado completely gone. "Not here, not in the open. We don't have to fight it," Jonas said quickly, thinking desperately. "But we might be able to distract it long enough to reach the sand." Captain Carroll glanced at him sharply. "Ow! With what?" Jonas pointed to a large piece of wreckage lodged between rocks near the cave entrance. An old mast segment, thick and heavy, probably weighing several hundred pounds. If we can push that timber into the cave mouth, it might block him temporarily, long enough for us to sprint for the beach. It was an insane plan, possibly suicidal. But looking at the rising tide behind us and the increasing sounds from within that cave, I couldn't think of anything better. Rory didn't wait for formal approval. Matteo with me. They moved before fear could paralyze them, gripping the thick timber and bracing their feet against the slippery rocks. I joined them on the other side, adding what strength I had. The mast was incredibly heavy, swollen with absorbed seawater, but together we managed to force it loose from where it had been wedged for years. The scraping inside the cave intensified dramatically. Something massive pressed against the interior wall, preparing to emerge. "Now!" Jonas hissed urgently. "Push now, with everything you have." We shoved with desperate strength, muscles screaming in protest. The mast rolled forward ponderously, gaining momentum. It slammed into the cave entrance with a tremendous impact, wedging itself between the rocks and partially blocking the opening. The scraping inside turned violent. The entire mass of stone shook. The timber shifted under enormous pressure, but held, for now. "Go!" Captain Carroll shouted. "Run! Move now!" We sprinted across the remaining rocks, no longer caring about careful footing, driven purely by terror and survival instinct. Behind us, an enormous crack echoed across the shore. The mast was breaking under the creature's assault. We reached the sand just as a final, splintering crash rang out. The timber had given way completely. "Don't look back," Jonas cried. "Just run. Keep running." We bolted along the beach, feet sinking into wet sand with each step. The tide lapped at our boots, waves washing around our ankles. We followed the natural curve of the island, trying to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and those caves. I did risk one glance backward. I couldn't help myself. A massive pale limb emerged from the darkness of the cave, then another. The creature pulled itself into the open air, its enormous bulk filling the cave entrance completely. It planted its limbs firmly in the sand and seemed to scan the shore with those twitching mouth parts, searching, analyzing. Then it saw us, or sensed us, or somehow knew exactly where we were. "Faster!" Captain Carroll yelled hoarsely. "It's coming!" We ran until our lungs burned agonizingly, until the waves splashed higher around our legs, until the beach narrowed dangerously between rising water and sheer cliff face. The creature advanced behind us at that same steady, unhurried pace we'd witnessed before. Not rushing, not stumbling, simply following with terrifying calm and absolute certainty. It knew we were trapped between rising water and solid rock. It knew time was on its side. It could afford to be patient. Then Jonas shouted, pointing frantically ahead. There! That gap! That narrow passage! A break in the cliff face appeared ahead. A vertical cut in the rock barely wide enough for two men to pass through side by side. Waves flowed into it and withdrew, the water dark and deep within. Beyond the gap, I could glimpse higher ground rising above sea level. If we reach that passage, Jonas gasped between breaths, it cannot follow. Its shell is too wide. It won't fit through. We sprinted with the last reserves of strength we possessed. The creature gained steadily behind us, its limbs sinking deep into the wet sand and propelling it forward with long, powerful strides. The grinding noise from its mouth parts rose in volume, echoing over the crashing waves with a quality that seemed almost eager. The tide surged suddenly around our legs, waist deep now, threatening to knock us off our feet and drag us under. "Go!" Captain Carroll shouted. "Into the gap! Move!" Rory entered first, forcing his broad shoulders sideways to fit between the rocks. The passage was even narrower than it had appeared from a distance. Matteo squeezed through after him with difficulty. Bram followed, his thin frame giving him a rare advantage. Old Finnegan limped in with considerable effort, his wooden leg scraping against stone. I went after him, twisting my shoulders uncomfortably to fit. Jonas stayed behind with Captain Carroll, covering our retreat even though their weapons were useless. The creature reached the start of the passage just as I squeezed through. Its front limbs slammed into the rocks with devastating force. Sand exploded upward. The entire cliff face shook violently, small stones raining down. It tried desperately to wedge itself into the gap, pushing forward with enormous strength. Stones cracked audibly under the pressure. The opening widened by inches, fragments breaking away, but its massive shell stopped it from progressing further. The space was simply too narrow for its bulk. "Don't stop moving," Jonas shouted, pushing me forward roughly. "Keep going until we're completely through." Captain Carroll squeezed into the passage behind us. Jonas slipped in last, his body thin enough to navigate the tight space more easily than the rest of us. We kept moving through the narrow tunnel, which extended much farther than I'd hoped, 30 feet, perhaps 40. Water flowed ankle-deep beneath our boots. Behind us, the creature continued clawing at the entrance, attempting to widen the gap by sheer force. More stones cracked and fell, but its progress was agonizingly slow. The tunnel finally ended, opening onto a steep rise of solid ground. When we reached the top and collapsed one by one onto relatively flat earth, I looked back down. Below us, at the narrow passage entrance, the creature remained. It scraped its limbs once more against the rocks, a sound of pure frustration, then slowly turned and retreated back toward the beach, returning to its territory with that same patient, unhurried gait. It knew, I realized with cold certainty. It knew we hadn't truly escaped the island. It knew we'd merely delayed the inevitable confrontation. It could afford to wait, to patrol, to guard every viable route back to our ship. Captain Carroll stood last, his face gray with exhaustion and growing desperation. "We'll find another path," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "There has to be another way off this cursed rock." But Jonas shook his head slowly, his expression hollow and defeated. "There is no other path. We have high ground. We have the night ahead of us. And we have a creature that knows every single inch of this island's geography far better than we ever could." He looked at each of us in turn, his gaze empty. "We survive tonight," he said flatly, "or we don't survive at all." The wind shifted direction, carrying the salt spray over us. The island fell quiet again around us, that oppressive, unnatural silence we'd come to associate with danger. We stood on that exposed rise until our breathing steadied and our heart rates began to slow, each man listening intently for any hint of movement, any sound that might indicate pursuit. The passage we'd squeezed through was now completely flooded up past chest height as the tide continued pushing inward relentlessly, effectively sealing off the shore from our current position. Only the grinding echo of the creature's retreat remained, faint now, distant, but utterly unforgettable. The sun had begun its inevitable descent, turning the sky a muted gold that felt grotesquely out of place on such a hostile, death-soaked island. Long shadows stretched across our position like grasping fingers. Captain Carroll wiped his face with his sleeve, smearing dirt and dried blood. We hold this ground through the night. Jonas, you know this cursed place better than anyone. Tell us honestly what we're facing. Jonas took a long, shuddering breath before answering. He patrols in regular cycles. He controls the shoreline absolutely and the lower forests. At night, he moves more inland. I've seen evidence of it, though I've never witnessed it directly. If he truly wants us, he'll eventually find a route to reach us. But he moves significantly slower on higher, rockier ground like this. The terrain doesn't suit his bulk as well. Rory sat heavily on a boulder, his massive shoulders stiff with tension. So we can fight him here? Make a stand? No, Jonas said with absolute certainty. Weapons slow him marginally at best, but they accomplish nothing useful. The joints of his limbs are too thick, too protected. His shell is incredibly dense, possibly hundreds of years old, layered and hardened over time. Even fire won't stop him. I've seen men try everything. Mateo shook his head in despair. Then we're cornered here. Trapped, not cornered, Jonas corrected. Just running out of places he doesn't control completely. There's a difference, though perhaps not one that matters in the end. Captain Carroll paced a tight circle, his mind clearly working through possibilities. We survive tonight. At first light tomorrow, we search for any way to circle back to the far cliffs. If we can find a path down to deep water, any path at all, we can construct a raft from driftwood, rope, whatever we can scavenge. We push off and let the current take us. A crude raft is better than staying here. Old Finnegan exhaled hard. We'll be completely exposed on open water. We're exposed now, Captain Carroll said grimly. At least on water, we have a chance. Here, we're simply waiting for that thing to decide when it wants to finish us. The light faded disturbingly quickly. Shadows stretched and merged across the rise, turning the ridge line into an uneven, threatening silhouette. I felt the island grow noticeably colder as darkness approached. The air seemed to press down on us with physical weight, as if night itself carried substance here. We spread out across the small rise, searching for anything that might help us survive the coming hours. The area wasn't large, just a relatively flat patch of stone and hardy grass surrounded by twisted roots. A narrow path sloped downward on the inland side, vanishing into impossibly thick trees and darkness. Jonas saw me looking at that path and immediately warned, "Don't even consider going that direction. It leads to hollow ground, old tunnels, collapsed caves, buried wreckage, areas where the soil has been undermined. Too easy to fall through unexpectedly. He uses those places extensively. You'd hear him coming far too late." We stayed close to the rise itself, keeping the solid rock beneath our feet. Rory found something interesting between two boulders, a half-collapsed lean-to constructed from broken branches and torn sailcloth. It had dried long ago, clearly built by some previous castaway in a desperate attempt at shelter. The canvas bore faded markings I couldn't quite read. Bram discovered a rusted lantern nearby, its glass cracked but the metal frame still intact. He held it up hopefully. If we could light this. No flame. Jonas interrupted quickly, almost frantically. Fire attracts him immediately. He senses the heat, sees the light. Darkness is our only camouflage now. We settled into a loose, defensive circle as true darkness crept across the island like spreading ink. The sun dropped completely behind the cliffs, leaving the world tinted deep blue before fading to black. Captain Carroll ordered us to eat what remained of our meager rations, har biscuit and dried meat that felt like sawdust in my mouth, but it kept gnawing hunger at bay. Full night came with shocking completeness. The forest below us disappeared into absolute blackness. No insects clicked their evening songs. No night birds called. The silence felt profoundly unnatural, suffocating in its totality. I strained my ears constantly, expecting at any moment to hear that dreaded scraping sound of the creature moving inland. The first sound came from somewhere far off to the north, a low, dragging thud that made the ground beneath us vibrate subtly. "North side," Jonas whispered, his voice tight. "He's definitely moving inland now, beginning his patrol." Another thud followed, then the unmistakable crack of a substantial tree being forced aside with contemptuous ease. "He's searching for us," Matteo said, trembling despite the relatively warm night air. Jonas nodded in the darkness. "He knows with certainty we're still on the island. He won't stop until he's systematically searched every place he can physically reach." Captain Carroll raised his pistol uselessly, though in the darkness we couldn't possibly see our target until it was directly upon us. Even then, our weapons had proven laughably ineffective. We stay absolutely quiet. Don't even breathe loudly. The thuds continued at irregular intervals, sometimes steady and purposeful, sometimes pausing for long periods. The creature's route seemed to circle the lower forest in a wide, methodical pattern, closing the loop incrementally with each pass. Bram whispered a prayer in Dutch, barely audible, more breath than words. Rory nudged him. "Save your breath for running. If he reaches us, prayers won't help." "I'm not praying for divine rescue," Bram murmured back. "I'm praying for courage and resolve." Time stretched agonizingly, each minute feeling weighted and endless. None of us dared lie down or close our eyes. The cold night air crawled through our clothes, making our joints stiff and our muscles cramp. Every slight sound, wind through leaves, the settling of stones, made us jump. Then the creature stopped moving entirely. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. At least when we could hear it, we knew approximately where it was. Now, in complete quiet, it could be anywhere. "He's listening," Jonas breathed, barely vocalizing at all. We didn't speak. We barely dared breathe. I kept my eyes fixed on the dark tree line, trying desperately to pick out shapes in the blackness. But the moon remained hidden behind thick clouds. Only the faintest outline of the forest remained visible. A slow scraping sound echoed from our right, much closer than before. My blood went ice cold. Another scrape, closer still. "He's climbing the ridge," Jonas said slowly, each word carefully controlled. Testing the approach, feeling for solid footing. Rory tightened his grip on his axe, the weapon useless but comforting. "If he comes up here, we hit him together with everything we have." Jonas shook his head in the darkness. "If he comes up, we run for the far slope and scatter in different directions. It's our only chance. He cannot chase multiple targets simultaneously. That's suicide," Matteo hissed desperately. "Staying together is guaranteed death," Jonas countered. "Scattering gives some of us, maybe not all, but some, a chance to survive." The scraping grew notably louder, unmistakably closer, developing a rhythm that suggested methodical progress. Small stones fell from the ridge's edge somewhere behind us, bouncing down the slope we'd climbed earlier. Old Finnegan backed up until his shoulders hit solid boulder. His face had gone completely pale. Captain Carroll raised his hand for attention. "Get ready to move. But no one runs until I give the explicit order." "Understood." We nodded in the darkness, though I doubt he could see us clearly. The creature's limb appeared first, pale and segmented, searching over the ridge edge like some enormous spider's leg. It tapped the stone carefully, testing its stability and weight-bearing capacity. The claw dug in slightly, scraping against rock with a sound that set my teeth on edge. The grinding from its mouth parts echoed through the darkness, vibrating through the stone beneath our feet. Then a second limb appeared, searching for purchase, and a third. The weight of its enormous bulk pressed into the ridge. The stone beneath it cracked with sounds like pistol shots. It pulled itself higher, inch by laborious inch. "Wait," Captain Carroll said quietly, his voice admirably steady. "Hold position. Wait." The ridge groaned ominously under the creature's tremendous weight. Loose rocks began tumbling more frequently, soil shifting and sliding. A deep crack echoed through the night. Not the creature, but the ridge itself protesting. The creature braced itself and pushed harder, trying to heave its bulk up onto the flat ground where we stood. "Keep moving," Captain Carroll shouted suddenly. "Don't stop until—" His words were cut off by a tremendous cracking sound. The entire ledge the creature was climbing collapsed catastrophically. The slab of stone beneath it broke away from the ridge entirely, tons of rocks suddenly giving way. The creature's limbs scrambled desperately for purchase, claws raking across the ridge face and tearing stone loose in huge chunks. But it couldn't arrest its fall. Its massive body toppled backward, rolling down the slope into the forest below with a thunderous, earth-shaking crash that seemed to go on forever. Trees snapped like kindling. Branches shattered. Leaves burst into the air in massive clouds. The ground shook so violently I nearly lost my footing on our rise. Then, finally, silence. We waited, frozen, muscles locked, hearts hammering, watching the shadowed trees below intently. Nothing moved. No sound came from the darkness. Jonas finally broke the tense quiet, his voice shaking. It fell into the hollow ground, the unstable area I warned about. Captain Carroll stared down into the darkness. "Is it dead? Can that thing die?" "No," Jonas said with certainty. "But it's trapped, at least temporarily. Maybe for minutes, maybe for hours, but not forever. That terrain will slow it significantly. The ground is treacherous, unstable, full of voids and sinkholes. But it will climb out eventually." Captain Carroll turned to us, his scarred face barely visible in the darkness. "This is our moment, our only window. We move now, right now, and we get off this cursed island before it frees itself." Rory grabbed Bram's arm, hauling him to his feet. "Up, on your feet. Move." Old Finnegan forced himself upright with a pained grimace. "Please tell me we're not running toward those bloody cliffs again." "Not the cliffs," Captain Carroll said. "We head inland, then loop back toward the far side. Jonas, lead us. Get us across this island before that thing digs itself out." Jonas nodded, his expression grim but determined. There's a narrow run of high, solid ground that crosses the island diagonally. It's dangerous, extremely narrow in places, but it's passable. And crucially, the creature won't reach it in time if we move quickly enough. "Then move," Captain Carroll ordered. We ran into the darkness without hesitation. Branches tore at our arms and faces as we plunged through the forest. Roots seemed to deliberately catch at our ankles. The ground sloped upward and downward in disorienting waves that made running treacherous. Jonas guided us with abrupt turns and sharp warnings, avoiding low patches of unstable earth and dangerously wide gaps between roots where a man could fall through and vanish. Behind us, after several minutes of desperate sprinting, a distant, faint scraping sound echoed through the trees, barely audible but unmistakable. "He's climbing out already," Jonas gasped. "Faster. We need more distance." We pushed harder despite burning lungs and cramping legs. Sweat poured down my face, freezing immediately in the cold night air. Mateo stumbled once over an invisible root, but Rory's iron grip on his collar kept him upright and moving. Bram kept muttering under his breath, prayers or curses, I couldn't tell which. At last, the trees began to thin perceptibly ahead. We broke through the final line of trunks and suddenly saw the ocean, vast and dark and beautiful in its promise of escape. A sheltered cove stretched below us, its water noticeably calmer than anything we'd seen on this island. Actual waves rather than crashing surf, almost gentle by comparison. Broken timbers lay scattered at the waterline, remnants of previous wrecks. And there, partially buried in the sand, sat what looked like a half-constructed raft. Jonas dropped to his knees beside it, examining it with frantic intensity. "Someone tried to escape from here," he said rapidly. "Years ago, perhaps decades. They didn't finish, but they got far enough that we can complete it." Captain Carroll immediately knelt, and began fastening the loose bindings with practiced sailors' knots. Everyone now, lift it together. Rory, Mateo, Old Finnegan, Bram, Jonas, and I all grabbed sections of the crude raft and heaved with desperate strength. The sand resisted at first, sucking at the wood, then suddenly gave way. The structure creaked ominously but held together, barely. Behind us, across the forest we just traversed, a distant roar vibrated through the night air. The creature, enraged, free again, hunting. "Push!" Captain Carroll shouted. "Into the water! Now!" We shoved the raft into the shallows, cold seawater splashing around our legs and soaking us to the waist. The raft dipped dangerously low as we climbed aboard one by one, but miraculously, it didn't break apart. Captain Carroll grabbed one of the long poles some previous castaway had left behind. "Hold on to something, anything." We pushed off from the beach with combined effort, using poles and hands in sheer desperation. The raft lurched into slightly deeper water just as another roar echoed across the island. Much closer now, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of something massive crashing through the forest toward our cove. "Paddle! Use your hands if you have to," Rory shouted. The current caught us unexpectedly, stronger than I'd hoped. The raft began drifting faster, pulled by invisible hands toward the open ocean. We helped along with frantic paddling, splashing, anything to gain speed and distance. The creature burst from the tree line and onto the beach, its enormous bulk silhouetted against the marginally lighter sky. It paced the sand frantically, limbs digging deep furrows into the earth, clearly unwilling to enter the deeper water of the cove. Jonas breathed out shakily. "We're past his range. He won't follow into deep water." We drifted farther out, the raft creaking but holding. The island began to shrink behind us, the treetops still bending and swaying as that enormous creature moved along the shoreline, pacing, watching, perhaps understanding that its prey had finally escaped. Hours passed in tense, exhausted silence. No one spoke. We simply drifted, letting the current do the work our exhausted bodies couldn't manage. Eventually, when the island was merely a distant, dark shape on the horizon, barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom, Captain Carroll finally broke the silence. "No treasure," he said quietly, his Welsh accent thick with exhaustion. "No gold, no silver, nothing. We came for riches and left with only our lives." Jonas nodded slowly. "Men have died there for centuries chasing gold. We live because we abandoned it." Old Finnegan looked back only once at the shrinking island. "Good. Let it sink back into forgotten waters where it belongs. Let it disappear from every map and every memory." Rory gripped his axe, which he'd somehow held onto through everything, and stared ahead at empty ocean. "Let's just get home. Anywhere but there." The island continued to shrink behind us, fading into the distance until it disappeared completely into the gray line where sea met sky. We never returned. We never spoke of it in detail again to anyone who'd believe us. But on quiet nights, when sleep won't come, I still hear the grinding of those enormous limbs moving across rock. I still see that pale, segmented body emerging from the forest. And I know, with absolute certainty, that the island is still there. Still waiting. Still guarded. Waiting patiently for the next crew desperate or greedy enough to want more than the sea was ever meant to give. Written as a navigator's personal account, recovered from estate papers, Kingston, Jamaica, 1758.